You can now take a hike in the water of beautiful Lake Tahoe. California state parks have developed Tahoe's first underwater trail. It's called the Emerald Bay State Park Maritime Heritage Trail, and it includes 4 different sites showcasing sunken historic boats.
To understand what was found, you first have to understand what Lake Tahoe actually is beneath its famous surface. Most people know the postcard version. The turquoise water, the granite peaks rising on every side, the clarity that seems almost impossible for a body of water this large. What most people do not know is the geological reality that makes all of that clarity possible, and that makes the lake one of the most effective natural vaults on the planet. Lake Tahoe sits in a basin formed by geological faulting roughly 2 million years ago, according to Wikipedia's geological record of the lake. The basin created a structure that descends nearly vertically from the shoreline into depths that most people never think about. The maximum depth reaches 1,645 feet, making it the second deepest lake in the United States, trailing only Oregon's Crater Lake. The lake holds an estimated 122 trillion gallons of water, enough, by one often cited measure, to cover the entire state of California to a depth of approximately 14 inches. The clarity that makes the lake famous is a product of its chemistry. The granite basin contributes almost no nutrients to the water. The cold temperatures, which hover in the low 40s Fahrenheit at the deepest levels year-round, inhibit the biological activity that would otherwise cloud the water with algae and organic matter. The lake is, by the standards of most freshwater bodies, remarkably sterile. That sterility is the engine of its beauty. And for 7 decades, that same sterility has been the engine of something far more troubling. Here is the physics that nobody puts in the brochures. Below roughly 1,500 feet in Lake Tahoe, the water does not mix with the surface layers in any meaningful way on a human timescale. The temperature differential between deep and shallow water creates a stratification that acts as a lid, trapping whatever sinks below it. The cold slows decomposition. The pressure keeps gases dissolved rather than allowing them to bubble up and signal what lies below. The darkness prevents the light-driven chemical reactions that break down organic and inorganic material in shallower environments. Whatever sinks to the bottom of Lake Tahoe does not rot in the ordinary sense. It does not dissolve. It waits. The story of what ended up at the bottom of Lake Tahoe begins with a transformation that reshaped the entire region, and it begins with a federal law that almost nobody remembers. In 1954, a federal statute effectively banned slot machines across the United States, with one notable exception, Nevada. As the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency's own historical records describe it, casinos in Los Angeles and San Francisco were suddenly shut down, and gamblers who wanted the experience had limited options. Las Vegas was one. The Nevada side of Lake Tahoe was another. The result was explosive. Once quiet border communities on the Nevada shore witnessed the construction of enormous casino towers almost overnight. Tourists who had previously given Tahoe a passing glance now poured in by the carload, by the busload, pursuing the combined attractions of gambling, mountain scenery, and alpine recreation. The Tahoe Regional Planning Agency's historical account describes the period after 1950 as one of unbridled economic growth and breakneck land development. The numbers bear that out. As Wikipedia's entry on Lake Tahoe records, the permanent residential population of the basin grew from roughly 10,000 people in 1960 to more than 50,000 by 1980, while the summer population grew proportionally. This was not gradual. This was a transformation measured in years, not generations. And transformation on that scale generates waste. Enormous quantities of it. Construction debris from the hundreds of buildings going up simultaneously. Chemicals from the industries servicing the new casinos, dry cleaning operations, industrial laundry facilities washing linens for thousands of hotel rooms, photography processing labs, paint and coating manufacturers, automotive service shops, metalworking operations. All of these generated byproducts. In the 1950s and early 1960s, environmental regulation was in its infancy. The concept of hazardous waste disposal, as it is understood today, simply did not exist as an operational framework. The environmental history of the Lake Tahoe Basin, as documented by the Tahoe Fund, describes the 1950s and 1960s as the period of the major damage to the lake. Jim Betch, who served as executive director of the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency, put it plainly in historical accounts. The unregulated development of those 2 decades was the primary environmental wound that subsequent generations have been trying to heal. At the time, The 61 separate agencies that nominally had regulatory authority over the basin were, according to historical accounts from Tahoe Daily Tribune records, operating in what one official described as utter chaos, with no uniformity of planning or environmental enforcement. For decades, that calculation held. Monitoring efforts, when they began in earnest in the late 1960s and 1970s, focused on the surface and the near-shore environment. The UC Davis Tahoe Environmental Research Center, which has been tracking the lake's water clarity continuously since 1968, measured deterioration visible from above. The clarity data tells its own story of damage. In the late 1960s, researchers could see a white measurement disk at depths exceeding 100 feet. By 2024, according to UC Davis's own published data, the same disk disappeared at 62.3 feet, down from 68.2 feet the previous year, representing one of the murkiest years on record. The causes identified by researchers were runoff, fine particles, air pollution, and the effects of climate change on the watershed. Nobody was looking at the bottom. Then came the drought. California's water history is punctuated by drought cycles, but the severity of the conditions that peaked in the early 2020s placed it in a different category. Historical records from the Tahoe Daily Tribune describe the situation at the lake as meeting the definition of the third driest year in over a century of recorded data. The lake's level, tracked by the USGS continuously since 1900, measures the water relative to the natural rim at Tahoe City. When evaporation and downstream demand outpace inflow from snowmelt and rain, the level falls. When it falls far enough, the lake drops below its natural rim entirely, cutting off the flow into the Truckee River downstream. By 2024, conditions had dropped the lake to levels not seen in years. The shoreline retreated. Old docks that had sat in water for decades suddenly stood on exposed ground. Boat ramps, as contemporary accounts from that period note, led to dry earth hundreds of feet from the waterline. And along the newly revealed stretches of lakebed, things began to appear that had not been visible within living memory. Colin West has spent more time looking at what is actually beneath the surface of Lake Tahoe than perhaps any other person alive. He is the founder and executive director of Clean Up the Lake, the nonprofit organization that between May 2021 and May 2022 conducted the first-ever comprehensive scuba cleanup of the entire 72-mile perimeter of the lake, operating in the zone from 0 to 25 feet of depth. The results of that effort are documented precisely. According to Clean Up the Lake's own published records and reporting from NBC Bay Area and the Tahoe Fund, the team made 189 separate cleanup dives over 81 dive days, used 626 cylinders of compressed air, and recovered 24,797 individual pieces of litter, weighing a combined 25,281 pounds. The items they pulled out tell a story about the lake that tourism brochures omit. Tires by the hundreds. Engine blocks, entire lamp posts, broken boat sections, lost personal items going back decades. One account described the discovery of what appeared to be a weapon in a black garbage bag thrown from a cliff. This was the near-surface layer, the zone accessible to ordinary recreational divers. It was the most visible, most accessible fraction of what actually lies below. By the time low water levels in 2024 opened new access to areas that had been submerged for generations, West teams were already shifting their attention to deeper zones. Clean Up the Lake's own project documentation describes plans targeting the 35 to 55-foot depth range, describing findings in those intermediate depths as significantly dirty based on 4 years of research and 60 separate deep dive surveys. This was the next layer down, beyond recreational diving, and into territory that required specialized equipment and gas mixtures. The transition from what scuba divers can access to what requires remotely operated vehicles is not merely a change in equipment. It is a change in world. Below the depth where sunlight penetrates, below the thermal layers where the cold becomes absolute and the pressure begins to approach figures that would crush an unprotected human body, the lake floor is a different environment. ROVs equipped with high-definition cameras, powerful lights, and mechanical sample arms can reach places that no human being has ever visited directly. And what those vehicles documented, as described in available reporting and in the accounts of research teams working in collaboration with the UC Davis Tahoe Environmental Research Center, was not what anyone expected. The debris field continued at depth. Vehicles from earlier decades appeared in the camera footage, their outlines preserved by the cold and the chemistry of the deep lake in ways that would not occur in warmer, shallower water. The same cold that inhibited the biological activity that clarifies the surface also inhibited the corrosion and decay that would normally erase submerged objects over 70 years. Paint remained visible on some surfaces. Interior features were recognizable. In the absence of the organisms that consume and break down organic material, and in water temperatures hovering near freezing year-round, objects deposited in the mid-20th century were in conditions that defied ordinary expectations. Among the debris documented at significant depths were large cylindrical objects, industrial drums, the kind used for chemical storage and transport in mid-century industrial operations. Not a few, not a cluster, a field of them, extending beyond what the ROV lights could illuminate, fading into the darkness of the deep basin in numbers that were measured not in dozens but in hundreds. Their distribution across the lake floor, in patterns consistent with multiple separate dumping events over an extended period of time, ruled out accidental deposition. Industrial drums do not roll off cliffs on their own. They do not fall from boats by accident in those quantities. Someone brought them to the lake deliberately and dropped them in water deep enough that no monitoring program of the era would ever detect them. The UC Davis Tahoe Environmental Research Center has been the scientific backbone of Lake Tahoe monitoring for over 50 years. The center's director, Jeffrey Schladow, has spent decades studying the lake, publishing the clarity data that documents its long decline, and testifying at public forums about the need for continued protection and remediation. The water samples taken from near the leaking containers at depth came back to those labs with results of a different category than anything the routine monitoring program had previously recorded. Heavy metals, lead at concentrations far above safe thresholds, mercury, cadmium, arsenic, industrial solvents that modern regulatory frameworks classify as hazardous waste requiring specialized containment and disposal. The chemical signatures were consistent with the industries that dominated the Lake Tahoe basin during the post-war development boom of the late 1940s through the mid-1960s. Metal processing, dry cleaning operations serving the casino hotels, automotive services, industrial laundry, paint manufacturing, photography processing. All of these operations produce hazardous byproducts. In the era before the environmental regulations that would take shape in the 1970s, the disposal options available were limited and expensive. Lake Tahoe was neither. The timeline reconstructed from the evidence suggested the heaviest dumping occurred during precisely the period that historical records identify as the peak of the region's unregulated development surge, roughly 1948 to 1965. This corresponds to the casino boom on the Nevada side, the construction wave that transformed the basin from a seasonal retreat for the wealthy into a year-round mass tourism destination, and the period that the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency's own executive director would later describe as when the major damage happened at Lake Tahoe. Lake Tahoe has carried a layer of darker stories beneath its scenic reputation for as long as the tourism industry has existed. The casino era on the Nevada shore, which the TRPA's historical records describe as bringing waves of gamblers and operators to communities that had almost no regulatory infrastructure, also brought the organizational structures that followed gambling into any unregulated environment. The Calneva Lodge, one of the most famous properties on the lake, counts in its documented history not only ownership by Frank Sinatra but visits by organized crime figures during a period when the distinctions between casino operations and criminal enterprise were significantly blurred. Historical accounts from the lake's own recorded past reference Marilyn Monroe, Dean Martin, and mob figures sharing the same resort spaces along the North Shore. For decades, local legend has held that the same depth and cold and darkness that made the lake convenient for industrial dumping made it convenient for other purposes. The organized crime presence in the Tahoe-Reno corridor during the casino era and the disputes between competing organizations that characterized that period generated a persistent folklore of bodies disposed of in the deep water. The cold temperatures that prevent normal decomposition and the depth that put remains beyond any feasible recovery technology of the time made the lake theoretically ideal for exactly this purpose. For most of the 20th century, this was treated as colorful local mythology. Something whispered about, occasionally referenced in journalism about the region's criminal history, but never substantiated. The ROV footage complicated that comfortable dismissal. Among the debris documented in the deepwater surveys were objects that did not fit the industrial dumping pattern. Personal effects, clothing remnants, items consistent with human presence rather than chemical disposal. And in several locations, what operators and researchers describe in accounts to regional reporters were forms that should not have been present in a natural underwater environment. The cold that halted the corrosion of steel drums and preserved the paint on 1950s automobiles operates on organic material as well. The same near-freezing temperatures, the same absence of oxygen, the same lack of decomposing organisms in the sterile deep basin that the lake's granite geology creates, act on human remains in ways that lake environments with normal biological activity do not. Washoe County law enforcement authorities confirmed in public statements that the deep water footage was under active review. The FBI was involved. The specific visual evidence from the deepest surveys was withheld from public release pending that investigation. What researchers and operators described in background conversations with reporters from regional outlets, speaking without attribution, was evidence consistent with the legends that have circulated around Lake Tahoe for half a century. Cases that went cold because there was nothing to find. Because there was never any body. Because the body was in the lake. The environmental response to what the ROVs documented presents a dilemma with no clean answer, and the researchers most closely involved with the data have said so publicly. The UC Davis Tahoe Environmental Research Center have been monitoring the lake's health for over 5 decades. The data on clarity alone tells a story of long-term decline despite significant investment. According to UC Davis's own published clarity records, the lake's annual average clarity in 2024 measured 62.3 feet, placing it among the worst years on record and roughly 40 feet worse than the baseline measurements taken in the late 1960s when monitoring began. CalMatters reported in 2025 that these numbers fall approximately 16 feet short of the state's clarity goals for 2031. The causes identified for the visible, near-surface decline include sediment runoff, air pollution, invasive species, and the effects of climate change on the watershed. The contamination from the deep barrels is a separate layer of the same crisis, operating on a different timescale and at a different depth. The question of what to do about hundreds of corroded industrial drums at 1,400 feet is not a question with an obvious answer. Disturbing compromised containers at extreme depths, in cold water, with equipment operating at the edge of its capabilities, risks accelerating the very release the remediation effort will be trying to prevent. A corroded barrel sitting undisturbed on the lake floor is leaking slowly. A barrel being lifted through 1,400 feet of water column under pressure differentials that change with depth is a different engineering proposition entirely. Some researchers have argued for a monitoring-based approach, document the extent of the contamination, track its migration, and intervene only when specific thresholds are reached. Others argue that leaving known toxic waste in an alpine lake that serves as a recreational and drinking water resource for millions of people is unacceptable regardless of the logistical difficulties of removal. State and federal agencies, including the California State Water Resources Control Board and the EPA's regional office, have formed working groups and commissioned studies. The regulatory machinery is in motion. But the contamination, as the sampling data shows, is also in motion, and the two are not moving at the same speed. The human remains present a different set of problems. Recovery operations at those depths require resources, legal frameworks, and logistical planning that are neither simple nor cheap. The cases they would reopen have been cold for 50 or 60 years. Witnesses are dead. Suspects are dead or unreachable. The evidence value of recovered remains, in the context of prosecutions that cannot realistically be pursued, is limited. For the families of missing persons, people who vanished in the Tahoe region during the casino era and were never accounted for, the question of recovery has nothing to do with prosecution and everything to do with closure. For a tourism industry that depends on the image of Lake Tahoe as pristine and safe and beautiful, the answer involves calculations of a different kind. The UC Davis Tahoe Environmental Research Center has been measuring water clarity at Lake Tahoe's long-term index station since 1968. Over 50-plus years of consistent measurement, the data describes a lake under sustained pressure from human activity. Summer clarity averages over the past decade have been among the worst on record, according to the center's own published reports. The lake is warmer than it was in earlier decades. It is more affected by wildfire smoke. Invasive species are altering its ecology. The clarity that once allowed visibility beyond 100 feet has declined to roughly half that. Scientists describe the lake as facing multiple simultaneous stressors with no simple remedy. Against this backdrop of documented, measurable, publicly reported decline in surface conditions, the deep water findings arrive as a different kind of revelation. The surface story and the deep story are connected. They are both chapters in the same narrative of what happens when a place of extraordinary natural value is developed faster than governance structures can manage, by industries operating without modern environmental accountability, in an era when the phrase hazardous waste had not yet entered the regulatory vocabulary. Lake Tahoe still draws approximately 15 million visitors per year, according to published accounts, more than Yosemite National Park. People come for the water, for the mountains, for the clarity that remains genuinely remarkable even in its diminished state. The lake is still beautiful. Nobody who stands at the shoreline and looks out over water that color, in that mountain setting, at that elevation, walks away unimpressed. The beauty is real. But the picture has always stopped at the surface. The tourism economy of the entire region depends on a version of Lake Tahoe that is complete only if you do not look down. The brochures show the blue water and the granite peaks. They do not show the 25,281 pounds of litter removed from just the first 25 feet of the shoreline perimeter by Colin West teams during a single year of operation. They do not show the clarity data that tracks a 4-decade decline that is not reversed despite billions of dollars in remediation spending. And they do not show what the remotely operated vehicles documented at 1,600 feet in the permanent cold and permanent dark of the basin floor. The drought of 2024 lowered the water. The lowering exposed the shoreline. The exposure prompted the surveys. The surveys sent the ROVs deeper. And the depth finally showed what 70 years of surface-level monitoring, looking at a lake from the direction of the sky, could never have revealed. A field of corroded industrial drums leaking compounds that were banned decades after they were deposited. Vehicles from the Eisenhower era sitting in darkness, so complete that their door handles are still intact. And something else that law enforcement agencies are still processing, in footage that has not been fully released, at depths where the cold that makes the lake so clear also makes the preservation of evidence indefinite. Water levels will rise again. They already have begun to, as heavy winter snowpack in early 2026 poured runoff back into the basin. The shoreline will submerge again. The newly exposed edges will slip back underwater. The view from the surface will be what it has always been, incomprehensibly blue, impossibly clear, one of the most photographed bodies of water in North America. But the barrels will still be there. The contamination will still be spreading. The footage from those ROV surveys exists, on servers and hard drives, and in the archives of research institutions that have been studying this lake for half a century. The knowledge that the water, which looks pure and ancient and untouched, has a different story at 1,600 feet is not knowledge that can be taken back. Lake Tahoe was always beautiful. It remains beautiful. What the drought of 2024 accomplished was not the destruction of that beauty. It was the completion of the picture. The part that was always missing. The part nobody photographed for 70 years because no camera could reach it, and nobody with the means to reach it was asking the right questions. The full picture is the one that includes both the blue surface sparkling in the Sierra Nevada sun and the darkness below it, the tourists and the drums, the postcard and the ROV footage, the lake that millions love and the vault that someone decided to use it as back when the roads into the basin had just been paved and the casinos were going up and nobody was watching the bottom. Both things are Lake Tahoe. They always were. We just could not see them both at the same time until the water went down.